Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and Distinguished Fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The Biden administration is sharply increasing tariffs on imports from China, including electric vehicles, batteries, and semiconductors, in an effort to protect U.S. jobs ahead of the election in November. The White House said the action was, quote, carefully targeted at strategic sectors, including aluminum and steel, critical minerals, solar cells, port cranes, and medical products, according to the Financial Times. The tariffs would apply to $18 billion worth of Chinese products, it said. The move follows a multi-year review of tariffs on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods imposed by then-President Donald Trump as part of his trade war with China. U.S. officials said the administration of President Joe Biden has decided to largely keep the other Trump tariffs in place. Walter, news or faux news?
Oh, it's news. I thought it was the evil old Donald Trump that was destroying our relationship with China and wrecking free markets around the world with his protectionism. But it turns out we have a new bipartisan consensus. I mean, the most interesting piece of this, I think, is the tariffs on EVs, Chinese-made EVs. Right now, that's actually insignificant in the sense there just aren't that many Chinese EVs in the U.S. market. But from everything we're hearing, the Chinese may be the only people on the planet right now making EVs that ordinary people would actually like to drive and, or rather can afford to drive. And so the fact that the Biden administration is putting tariffs on those, really, I think I've seen figures up to 100% tariffs. Those are pretty striking, and they also suggest that in some ways industrial policy is even trumping climate activism in administration councils. I mean, on the one hand, keeping Chinese EVs out of our market will help in the U.S. producers that they are trying to stimulate and subsidize here to build EVs in the U.S. But it clearly will delay, all things being equal, will significantly delay adoption of EVs by American drivers, which is remarkable. And it does suggest that even in the Biden administration, ideas like geopolitical competition, especially when aligned with trade protectionism and the union vote, do trump climate considerations to some degree. So I think for those of us trying to figure out what a second Biden term might look like, this is interesting.
In general, do you think this bipartisan revival of major tariffs as a tool of economic policy we've seen in the last 7 years makes some sense? Is there a role for them to some degree, or is this all kind of a bad idea?
Well, I would say to some degree it's necessary on grounds of national security, that you simply have to think about your supply chains when you might be at war with a country that currently occupies a lot of spaces in your supply chains. So, or that a war in the Pacific could interrupt our ability to access all kinds of things that we now buy in China. So we clearly have to be thinking intentionally and from a national security standpoint about some of these things. And on things like chips, it's even more important. You don't want little back doors being put in your chips that could open up horrifying vulnerabilities. So there is clearly a need to think about this stuff in a different way. But I think we should not forget that all things being equal, free trade is actually more economically efficient. Now, I would agree with people who say economic efficiency isn't the be-all and end-all of all policy. It's not the only thing to think about, but there is a real price when you stop. So what it means is the more protectionist we become, the more sand we're sprinkling in the gears of the world economy, the more friction there's going to be. For example, higher levels of unemployment may well set off inflation. And people have a lot of terrible things to say about the 25 years of neoliberal trade policy after the end of the Cold War. But remarkably, those were years of very low inflation and some pretty good economic growth. So we're going to see we're going to see sort of basically economic conditions getting more sour. Now, that for us doesn't mean we're going to go into constant recession or everything will be horrible, but that presidents and Congresses are going to be facing the bond market will get the vapors earlier, interest rates will go up earlier. People are going to hate this. They won't be smart enough as a general rule of thumb to blame it on trade policy. So politicians are going to start taking a lot of blame for other things. So that's part of it. There will be more factories and so on opening in the US. I'm pretty skeptical about the idea that this is what you hear from some people, that this is going to generate a new golden age of middle class prosperity based on stable factory work. I think it's going to generate a new age of Silicon Valley prosperity based on middle class robot work. That labor costs in the U.S. Are high enough that it pays, it's worth it to Amazon to invest in robots that can move boxes on shelves. It is certainly going to be worth it to car manufacturers and others to increase automation in their factories. So I would be skeptical that this is going to achieve the golden paradise that it happens. The other problem that you have, and especially in a system like ours, is all trade policy becomes, this is ambrosia for special interests. It's like I can pass a law that means that I can charge higher prices for my products. And you go back to the days when the U.S. did have protective tariffs, mostly before the Second World War. And, the Pennsylvania wool lobby, there were all of these special interests, the corruption that ensued, the lobbying. And so all of this, the feeding frenzy is going to come back. Now, if you're a politician, this is not so bad. If my little congressional subcommittee can basically decide how much money your company is going to make this year, well, perhaps you want someone like me who really understands the issues to be in charge of this subcommittee, not one of these hot-headed other people who has, these sort of crazy ideas. So I think we're going to see some changes. They are not all going to be good. Some of them are going to be necessary.
All right, our second story. Senior Israeli officials fear Egypt may cease mediating between Jerusalem and Hamas regarding a Gaza truce and hostage deal, and have warned that the military and intelligence cooperation between the countries will be harmed if the current crisis continues. A Tuesday report from Haaretz came as Israel and Egypt accuse each other of hindering the flow of aid into Gaza, after Cairo said this week it will join South Africa's genocide case against Israel in the International Court of Justice, and after Egyptian sources threatened that a planned offensive in Rafah would endanger the 1979 peace accord between the two countries. Walter, news or faux news?
News, but with a good mix of faux news. That is to say, what's real here is it's clear that the Egyptians are feeling the heat of the current situation in the Middle East. They're in a tough situation. Thanks to our Houthi friends, revenue through the Suez Canal is significantly down. Egypt needs that money, and it's the economy is not doing well. This will shock you, I know, but this doesn't seem to be a time a lot of people are saying, let's invest in Egypt. This is probably not, haven't had the numbers yet, but my guess would be this is probably not the greatest summer that Red Sea tourism has seen. And if you think about that, that's actually a lot of Egypt's income there is tourism. They had COVID and now they've got a war. This is not, a lot of people are hurting in Egypt. The government has absolutely no sympathy for Hamas. It is, and not a lot for the Palestinians in Gaza, in the sense that if Egypt really, if the well-being of the Palestinians was top of the Egyptian priority list, they would have allowed Palestinians to do what people normally do in a case of a war, which is cross an international boundary, say as Ukrainians have done to get away from Russia. The Palestinians could have crossed into the Sinai, into Egyptian territory. That's not happening. And for the very good reason that Hamas is aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the principal political enemy of the Sisi government. So nothing that's happening here is changing that. But I think what we're seeing is the Egyptian government is feeling the need to take public feeling into account, public anger at Israel, anger at what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. The decision to join the South African complaint, I would say that is sort of the epitome of faux news, because it's not like these judges are going to say, oh, well, we were going to dismiss it when it was South Africa. But now that Egypt has weighed in, we have no choice. I mean, they're guilty as hell, obviously. All right. That's not how anything works. So this looks to me like a pure PR play by the Egyptian government. And that is just interesting because they feel the need to do it. The question of whether they're going to not be mediators with Hamas or what exactly is going on with Rafah. I think unless you're actually sitting in the room in a skiff somewhere reading some traffic that Jeremy, unless you have some activities I don't know anything about, neither you nor I is reading. This is a little harder for outsiders to see what's actually happening. Is this posturing? It could well be. Is there actually some specific role? What is the problem about Rafah from the Egyptian side? Is it loss of face in that the Israelis had apparently been coordinating very carefully with them, but then rather abruptly changed direction? Is it that? Is it that there are certain elements of the Egyptian military that were profiting quite handsomely from the status quo and suddenly aren't? Is it concerned that there is sensitive information about Egypt's role in maybe not always supervising everything that went through that crossing that the Egyptians are nervous might get out? Or is this, again, deeply felt sincere anger at Israeli bad behavior in Gaza? We don't know. But the real grain of news here is that the Egyptian government feels the need to take a public stand separating itself from Israel.
One quick follow-up about the border crossing. Israel's apparently been trying to convince the Palestinian Authority to help manage the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, but was reportedly rebuffed this week by the PA, which said it would only agree to take over if Israel agreed to the plan being crafted by some Arab countries to eventually establish a Palestinian state. What do you make of that? What are Israel's options here?
Well, I've also heard some other discussion about this issue, which is that another demand they have is that certain tax revenues that are being withheld be released. So again, without knowing a lot more than we're likely to know unless we're actually in the bowels of government, at which point we're not telling people. What you can say here is that we're in the bazaar, and Israel wants something, and the Palestinian Authority is not going to give it to them without a price. None of this should be surprising to anybody.
Final story of the week. Starting this week, Google users in the US will see a new feature, AI Overviews, that generates information summaries above traditional search results. According to the New York Times, AI Overviews is likely to heighten concerns that web publishers will see less traffic from Google search, putting even more pressure on the journalistic and media industries. Most publishers receive a significant chunk of traffic from people going to Google, searching for something, and clicking on articles about it. That traffic, in turn, allows publishers to sell ads and subscriptions, which pay for the next wave of articles, which Google can then show to people who go searching for the next thing. But if the AI answer engine does its job well enough, users won't need to click on any links at all. Whatever they're looking for will be sitting right there on top of their search results. And the grand bargain on which Google's relationship with the open web rests, you give us articles, we give you traffic, could fall apart. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, I think, first of all, that's a real mischaracterization of the Google media relationship. As I understand it, it's more Google says, you give us everything and we'll sprinkle a few crumbs. It's not actually suddenly now that it's in danger, journalists are getting very nostalgic about a relationship that journalists have been denouncing for 25 years as one of the most atrocious crimes in the history of the human race. So I'm not as impressed by that part of it. But I do think that And I also don't think that Google can eat the entire media. I mean, what will the AI be searching if no one is writing any articles? Somebody has to be producing. You can't steal if there's nothing to steal. So does this mean that Google plans to hire a bunch of chatbots and laid off call service people to sort of gin up the content that the AIs will then skim? I don't know where we're going, but it does say that in this information business, you have got to stay nimble because you cannot take anything for granted, certainly not the goodwill of Google.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So, a crucial military relationship between the United States and its closest West African ally, the country of Niger, ruptured this spring after a visiting U.S. official made threats during last-ditch negotiations over whether American troops based there would be allowed to remain. The country's prime minister put the blame for the breakdown squarely on the U.S., accusing American officials of trying to dictate which countries Niger could partner with, meaning Russia and China, and failing to justify the U.S. troop presence, now scheduled to end in the coming months. You wrote this week, Walter, about how Niger was a poster child for American democracy efforts in Africa and the foundation of U.S. counterterrorism strategy in the region, and how the breakdown in the relationship and the failure of U.S. democracy efforts in Africa more broadly have been exploited successfully by Russia's Wagner Group, and how a lot of this is the result of U.S. policy in Africa being dominated by NGOs, activist groups, and agencies like USAID, which have kind of fetishized democracy promotion and human rights policy over more maybe practicable measures. You don't hear as much about America's democracy promotion agenda as you used to, but it's obviously still out there in the world, and it seems to still be failing after almost a quarter of a century. What lessons do you think there are from these failures, and will we learn them?
Yeah, it's Americans are actually not that good at promoting democracy in other people's countries. We're actually not all that good about promoting it at home, but that's another story. But what often happens is because there are political pressures, go democracy, democracy is nice, there are lots of people who care about it. What tends to happen in the Washington policy process is that countries and regions that other people don't care about very much get kind of given over as a playground to the NGO crowd and the lobbyists. I mean, this isn't always, by the way, human rights or democracy thing. In the old days, it's kind of like, Central America, fine, United Fruit, nobody but banana growers cares anything about Central America, so you can go annex that piece of American foreign policy. So when you're really interested in something and no one else is interested in it at all, there you go. But there are a lot of people in the world, USAID, NGO world, who are very strongly ideologically motivated and sort of don't really see their jobs as promoting American strategy overall, but as really, they say, well, actually, these values are really important to American strategy, and and I'm going to focus on this. Remember once I was in the city of Shenyang, which is the closest U.S. consular facility to North Korea in China. And, a city, it's the only place in the world where North Korean and U.S. diplomats, at least at this time, could actually talk at diplomatic receptions because there were so few diplomats that it would be impossible not to. And I remember talking to one of the staffers there, American staffers, who was really proud that they had succeeded in getting a kind of LGBTQ event on this, some sort of event in Shenyang about this. And really, like, wow, I've really accomplished something. I don't think they did, actually. And I look at, again, to me, Afghanistan is the kind of model of this where for 20 years the US was doing all of the civil society building, universities, development agencies, rural co-ops, millions of things, and all kinds of earnest, well-intentioned people, having workshop sessions and conferences and studying it and creating plans and then the Taliban comes in and poof, what you have is a lot of refugees. In the same way, you can see some of the same stuff, I think, happening in some of these African countries. Some years ago, there was an election in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I remember reading that they were airlifting by helicopter ballots to remote towns in the Congo. First of all, you want to say, like, okay, wait, you haven't even built roads to towns and you were using money to helicopter ballots, but you think, how many people in those towns die every year because there is no aerial medevac to a hospital from where they're. It's insanity. It's insanity. It's a mania. And what tends to happen in the NGO world, the foundation world, is that these fads create a kind of a bubble. And everybody in the bubble, this is going to work. This is not like the last 35 failed development strategies since we started this thing in 1948. No. This new one with the clever additional twist, the special little, beautiful woke glitter or gender justice glitter or really smart economic planning glitter. This is the one that's really going to make it work. And people get this kind of tunnel vision. It's crazy. You're fine. In my view, a lot of this stuff really should not be something the government does. I would be happier if private, people in the private sector, foundations and other things do this on their own. U.S. officials would be in some cases involved, like we were with missionaries in the 19th century. They're American citizens. They deserve consular protection. So you're not totally hands off here. But I do think that the kind of NGO industrial complex, which is not necessarily the wisest or even the most benevolent aspect of our society at any given time, in these countries where civil society is weak, economies are weak, they tend to sort of go off on these bizarre tangents. American government policy cannot get too tangled up in this, I think. A very unpopular thing to say in Washington because there is a big industrial democracy lobby. But it is, there might even be more democracy in the world if there was less government money going to democracy promotion.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this time from John in New York, who wants to know what your writing habits are.
Oh, they're terrible. They're very irregular. What happens with me, I think, is I'll go several days without really writing a word, and then I'll come to a burst. The column's a little different. That column has a deadline, 800 words, needs to be there. The newspaper is waiting. Paul Gigot and James Taranto want the copy on time, and it's my job to do it. So I'm a little more disciplined about that. In some ways, it goes back to college, where I got to where I knew that I needed an hour per page of a term paper to get it in onto by deadline. So if it was a 12-page term paper, well, obviously you start writing 12 hours before it's due. Maybe if you want to be super cautious, 13. But I try not to do as many all-nighters these days as I did when I was 19 or 20 years old. But you do have a sense of, okay, it's going to take me about X amount of time to think it through, and then, you get a draft. One tip I will share is that a difference, I think, between professional writers and amateur writers, other than the professionals are getting paid, not much thanks to Google, but we've already discussed that the professional writer actually the amateur writer hates revision and often sees that as somehow, my beautiful native style being, cramped and the revision is just terrible. The more experienced professional writer hates a blank piece of paper, hates having nothing. Get me some stuff on the page, even if it's terrible. I can work with it. I can turn it into something. I know it's much better to turn something mediocre into something good than to turn nothing into anything. So I find often the biggest battle is just to force yourself to put it out there on the page, on the screen. Then you can sit back and you can start to make it fun, make it nice.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.